I count in my sleep now. 10, 9, 8. The rhythm never stops, even when the guns are silent. Even here, in the Medicae ward 3 decks below where the void-facing bulkheads press close, I mouth the numbers. The nurses think it's brain damage. They're not entirely wrong. When you've loaded macro cannon shells for 6 years aboard the Eternal Dominion, a dictator-class cruiser serving the Segmentum Obscurus fleet, certain things become permanent. The countdown is one of them. The ringing in your ears is another. The way your hands shake when they're not gripping something heavy, that's the third. I tell myself I'm writing this down because the administratum requested testimony for some logistics review. That's partially true. They want to know about efficiency rates, crew sustainment, ammunition consumption patterns, but I'm also writing this because I need someone to understand what happens down there, in the gun decks, where the Emperor's wrath gets manufactured 1 shell at a time, where boys become loaders and loaders become something else, where Mikhail went, where Jens went, where eventually we all go. The gun deck of a macro cannon battery isn't what you imagine. Before I was pressed into naval service from Hive Tertius on Scintilla, I'd seen the propaganda reels heroic gunners standing at gleaming weapons, firing devastating salvos at the Emperor's enemies while triumphant music played. The reality is a tunnel, a long, narrow tunnel of reinforced ceramite and adamantium, hot enough to make you dizzy, loud enough to make your teeth ache, and so thick with gun oil and propellant residue that the air tastes like you're chewing on a Leho stick filter that's been soaked in promethium. Our battery, gun deck, 17, starboard primary, macro cannon assembly 4 through 8, ran the length of 3 hab blocks, 5 massive guns, each one capable of hurling a shell the size of a Chimera transport across void space to punch through enemy ship armor. Each gun needed a crew, each crew needed loaders, and loaders, we learned quickly, were the most expendable part of the equation. I was loader 3 when I started. That's how they designate you, not by name, by function and position. Loader 1 worked closest to the gun's breech mechanism. Loader 2 assisted with shell alignment. Loader 3, my position, hauled shells from the magazine feed to the loading cradle. Loader 4, if you had one, helped with the hauling. Our crew had 4 loaders when I arrived. We usually operated with 3, sometimes 2. Once, memorably, Gun Assembly 5 fired an entire engagement with just 1 loader, and that man received a commendation from the Master of Gunnery before he died 3 days later, from what the medical log called catastrophic systemic failure. They don't tell you it's the routine that kills you. They warn you about enemy fire, about boarding actions, about warp travel madness. Nobody mentions that the job itself is designed to break your body like a machine breaking scrap metal. Systematic, efficient, complete. We worked in 12-hour shifts, but during combat operations, shifts became meaningless. You worked until the engagement ended, or you collapsed, whichever came first. A macro cannon shell weighs approximately 140 kilograms. It's a cylinder of reinforced metal packed with explosives and penetrator cores, about 2 meters long, with handles welded to the casing that bite into your palms even through work gloves. During a standard firing sequence, each gun could discharge once every 45 seconds if the crew performed perfectly. 5 guns meant we were handling, aligning, and loading shells in a constant, overlapping rhythm that left no time for rest, no time for thought, only the mechanical repetition of lift, carry, align, load, clear, repeat. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. That's the countdown. You hear it in your sleep because you hear it thousands of times while awake. The gun captain calls it out before every shot, partly as a timing mechanism for the crew, partly as a safety warning. 10 seconds from his call to the gun's discharge. 10 seconds to get the shell loaded, the breech sealed, your body clear of the recoil mechanism that would crush you to pulp if you were in the wrong position when the gun fired. 10 seconds that feel both infinite and instantaneous, every single time, I learned the countdown my first day. During orientation, we stood in the battery's assembly area, 7 new loaders pulled from the lower decks where we'd been processed aboard, facing a gun captain named Horvath. He was 31 years old and looked 60. His hands were wrapped in so much scar tissue that his fingers no longer bent properly at the joints. When he spoke, his voice was a rasp, like his throat had been damaged. I learned later that happens from breathing the propellant fumes. They scar your lungs, your throat, everything soft inside you. You'll learn to love the countdown, he told us, though his face suggested he loved nothing. It's the only friend you'll have down here. It tells you when to move, when to load, when to clear. Miss it, and you'll lose a limb. Miss it twice, and you'll lose your life. The gun doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care about your prayers or your fear. It fires every 45 seconds, and if you're in the way when it does, we'll scrape what's left of you off the deck and promote someone else to your position. He wasn't exaggerating. I saw it happen to a man named Petrin, maybe 3 weeks after I started. He was Loader 1 on Gun Assembly 6, and during a firing drill against simulated targets, he failed to clear the recoil zone before the countdown ended. The gun discharged. The recoil mechanism slammed backward with the force of an industrial stamper, and Petran simply ceased to exist in any form you could call human. They hosed down the deck afterward. His replacement arrived within the hour, a boy from the lower ratings who looked terrified and was dead from heat exhaustion before the week ended. That's the first thing I noticed, how quickly people disappeared and how little anyone remarked on it. Transferred, they'd say. Moved to another battery. Reassigned to different duties. But I never saw anyone leave the gun deck voluntarily. I never saw anyone get promoted up and out. People vanished, and new people arrived, and the work continued without interruption. Mikhail vanished in my second month. He'd been Loader 4, a quiet man from some agri-world who barely spoke but worked with mechanical precision. One day he was there, the next day he wasn't, and a new Loader 4 was hauling shells beside me, and nobody could tell me where Mikhail went. When I asked Horvath, he looked at me like I'd asked about the color of the warp. "He's gone," Horvath said. "That's all you need to know." But where did gone? The word was final. Focus on your count. 10, 9, 8. And I did. Because the countdown starts whether you're ready or not. And if you're not ready, you become another name nobody remembers. So I counted, and I lifted, and I carried, and I tried not to think about where Mikhail went, or why Horvath's hands looked like melted wax, or why the medical officer came through the gun deck every week with a data slate, making notes about each crew member without ever speaking to us directly. The heat was the second thing. Macro cannons generate tremendous thermal energy when they fire. The barrel heats to temperatures that would melt flesh on contact. The breech mechanism radiates heat like a furnace. Even the shells grow warm when they're loaded, pulled from magazines that sit adjacent to guns that have been firing repeatedly. During combat operations, when all 5 guns in our battery fired continuously for hours, the temperature in the gun deck climbed above 50 degrees Celsius. Men collapsed. Boys cried. We all learned to function through heat exhaustion as if it were normal, drinking water that tasted like metal from containers that were never quite clean, pouring it over our heads during the brief seconds between loading cycles. I lost 15 kilograms in my first month. My body consumed itself, burning fat and then muscle to fuel the relentless physical demands. We ate protein bars that tasted like chemical paste and drank supplements that were supposed to prevent malnutrition, but mostly just made us urinate strange colors. The Navy allocated resources based on function. Gunners received better rations than loaders. Engineers received better rations than gunners. Command received better rations than everyone. We received enough to keep us moving, nothing more. Jens used to joke about it. He was Loader 2 when I started, a lean man with a dark sense of humor and a tattoo on his forearm that read, "The Emperor Protects," in Gothic script. We're not crew. he'd say during the brief rest periods when the guns were silent. "We're ammunition components. They load us into the battery the same way they load shells into the gun. We're just expendable materials being consumed by the ship." I thought he was being dramatic. Then I started paying attention. The medical officer's visits became a pattern I could track. Every 7 days, he'd walk through the battery with his data slate, scanning each crew member with an augmetic device built into his wrist. He'd pause, make notes, move on. He never spoke directly to us, only to Horvath, and only in tones too quiet to overhear. I noticed that certain crew members received special attention, longer scans, more detailed notes. I noticed that those crew members usually disappeared within a week or two of such examinations. I mentioned this to Jens during one of our rest periods. We were sitting against the bulkhead, far enough from the guns to hear each other without shouting, drinking water that tasted like rust. "You're overthinking," Jens said, but his eyes said otherwise. "People get reassigned. It's normal." "Where do they get reassigned? Have you ever actually seen someone leave and go somewhere else on the ship?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he finally admitted. "But I've seen what happens to people who ask too many questions. They get reassigned too, just faster." So I stopped asking questions aloud. But I kept counting, and not just the firing countdown. I counted how many people cycled through our battery. In my first 3 months, 17 loaders came and went across our 5 gun crews. Some lasted weeks, some lasted days. One boy, fresh from some skolum where he'd probably dreamed of serving the Emperor with honor, lasted 4 hours before the heat and exertion caused his heart to simply stop. They carried him away, and a new loader was hauling shells before the body reached the Medicae deck. The turnover rate was extraordinary. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it became normal, the way anything becomes normal if you experience it long enough. Death and disappearance were just part of the routine. Like the heat, like the countdown, like the way your hands bled inside your gloves from gripping the rough shell casings. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. The countdown became meditation. I'd haul a shell from the magazine feed, a journey of perhaps 15 meters down a deck so hot the metal floor could burn through boot soles. I'd lift with my legs, not my back. That was the first rule, though most loaders forgot it under pressure and damaged themselves permanently within months. I'd carry the shell to the loading cradle, a steel framework that held the ammunition at the correct angle for breech insertion. I'd align it with Loader 2's help, sliding the cylinder into position with precision that became instinctive. Loader 1 would seal the breech, spinning the lock mechanism, a massive wheel that required full body strength to turn until the gun captain signaled ready. Then the countdown. 10 seconds to clear the recoil zone. 10 seconds to position yourself for the next load. 10 seconds during which the gun's machine spirit or whatever dark mechanism controlled these weapons prepared to unleash violence at a scale that could crack enemy vessels open like eggs. The sound when a macro cannon fires isn't something you can adequately describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's not a bang or an explosion, those words are too small. It's a physical force that hits your entire body, a shockwave that passes through flesh and bone and makes your organs hurt. The first time I heard it, I lost control of my bladder. The 100th time, I barely noticed. By the 1000th, it was just background noise, another part of the rhythm that defined existence on the gun deck. But even as I adapted, I watched my body change. My hands developed thick calluses across the palms and fingers. Then those calluses split and bled. Then they scarred over with tissue that was tough but numb. I lost feeling in parts of my fingers. My hearing degraded despite the protective plugs we wore. The sound was simply too powerful, too constant. I developed a persistent cough from the propellant fumes, the same rasping cough that every crew member had, that made us sound like we were dying even when we felt fine. My muscles adapted too, but not in any healthy way. My back and shoulders grew grotesquely overdeveloped while the rest of me wasted away. I looked like a genetic mistake, like something that had been built for a single purpose and optimized until everything unnecessary had been stripped away. I saw the same transformation in everyone. Loaders all developed the same body type, massive upper body, thin legs, hands like clubs of scar tissue, faces hollowed out from chronic dehydration and malnutrition. We became specialized tools, optimized for function, discarded when we broke. Jens disappeared in my 5th month. One day he was there, helping me align a shell while making a dark joke about the prayer inscriptions some crew member had scratched into the barrel. The Emperor protects, but penetrator cores work faster. The next day, a new loader 2 was working beside me. A woman named Kira, who had transferred from a different battery and didn't speak at all, just worked with grim efficiency and eyes that looked somewhere beyond the bulkheads. I asked Horvath where Jens went. He gave me the same answer he'd given about Mikhail. Gone. But, you want to join him? Because I can arrange that. Horvath's ruined hands gripped my shoulder with surprising strength. You do your job. You count. You load. You survive. Or you don't. But you don't ask questions. Understand? I understood. But understanding didn't stop me from wondering, or from noticing patterns, or from watching the medical officer make his rounds with increasing dread, because I'd realized something. The officer scanned us with his device. He made notes, and the people who received the most attention, the longest scans, the most detailed notation, they were always the ones who showed the most physical damage, the ones whose hands were most scarred, whose hearing was most degraded, whose bodies had been most thoroughly transformed by the work. They were taking the people who were almost broken. That's what I realized in my 6th month, watching a loader named Krennic receive an extensive scan 2 weeks before he vanished. They weren't reassigning us to lighter duties or medical care. They were waiting until we reached some specific threshold of damage, and then they were taking us somewhere. But where? And why? The answer came during our first major engagement, a fleet action against what the Vox announcements called pirate elements, but what the veteran crew knew were Chaos Raiders. We'd been at patrol routine for months, firing practice rounds at debris or running unloaded drills. But when the combat klaxon sounded and the gun deck transitioned to active operations, everything changed. Combat operations meant continuous firing. Not one shot every 45 seconds, that was the minimum cycle time. During real combat, you fired as fast as you possibly could, pushing the limits of what the crew could sustain, trying to pump as many shells as possible into enemy vessels before they did the same to you. The countdown compressed. Horvath's voice became rapid fire, barely intelligible. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. 10, 9, 8. We loaded shells for 11 hours straight. No breaks. No rest. No time for water or food or thought. Just lift, carry, align, load, clear, repeat. Lift, carry, align, load, clear, repeat. The heat climbed until I thought my brain would boil inside my skull. The sound became a constant thunder that made reality feel liquid. Men screamed when the shells burned their hands through their gloves. A loader on gun assembly 7 collapsed and had to be dragged clear while his crew worked around his body. Another man on gun assembly 4 was too slow clearing the recoil zone. I heard the wet crunch even over the gunfire, but I didn't look, couldn't look, because my own countdown was running and my own shell needed loading, and if I hesitated I'd be next. The engagement lasted 16 hours. When it finally ended, when the enemy vessels were destroyed or driven off, and the ceasefire order came through, I collapsed where I stood. Not from exhaustion alone, though that was part of it. My body simply stopped functioning. My muscles locked. My vision narrowed to a tunnel. I remember lying on the deck, feeling the heat through my uniform, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue, and thinking with perfect clarity, this is how I die. But I didn't die. The medical teams came through, administering stimulants and fluids, getting us back to minimum functionality. They triaged the injured, prioritizing those who could return to duty. 3 loaders didn't receive treatment. They received body bags. The rest of us received injections that made our hearts race and our hands steady, and within 6 hours, We were back at our positions for post-engagement maintenance. That's when I saw it. The medical officer came through during maintenance, but this time he wasn't alone. He had orderlies with him, and they were collecting specific people, 5 crew members, including Kira, the silent loader 2 who'd replaced Jens. The officer scanned her, nodded to his orderlies, and they escorted her away. She didn't resist. She looked almost relieved, as if she'd been waiting for this. I made the mistake of following them. Not obviously, I had maintenance duties that took me through the same corridors, but I kept them in sight, watching where they went. They didn't head toward the Medicae decks on the upper levels. They went down, deeper into the ship, toward the engineering sections and the servitor maintenance bays. I stopped following when I heard the sounds. Mechanical, clinical, the whir of surgical equipment, and the hiss of pneumatic tools. I stood in that corridor, 2 decks below the gun batteries, listening to what I couldn't quite identify but somehow knew with absolute certainty. And I understood where Mikhail went, where Jens went, where Kira was going right now. They were making servitors, not from executed criminals or vatborn, the way the propaganda reels claimed. From us, from crew who'd been damaged past efficiency, whose bodies had been worn down by service, who were no longer optimal for their original function but still contained salvageable parts. The Navy was recycling us, literally, turning broken loaders into mindless servo-automata who could be used for menial labor throughout the ship. It was efficient. It was economical. It was absolutely in keeping with Imperial policy, which valued function over sentiment, and it meant that everyone on the gun deck was temporary. We were all just raw material on a gradual slide toward disassembly and repurposing. I returned to my duties. What else could I do? Report it to someone? To whom? The master of gunnery who set the duty schedules? The captain who commanded the ship? They all knew this was policy, not abuse. This was the Navy functioning exactly as designed, maximizing the utility of every resource, including human beings who'd volunteered or been pressed into service and signed documents they probably couldn't read that gave the administratum rights over their flesh until death or discharge. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. I kept counting, kept loading, kept surviving. But now every medical examination felt like a countdown of a different sort. The officer would scan my hands, my lungs, my back, making notes about degradation levels, efficiency decline, suitability for reclamation. I was being graded on a curve, and the bottom of the curve ended in a servitor bay. My 7th month marked a change. We received a new loader one, a veteran who'd been transferred from another ship, a man named Greg who was maybe 40 and looked 70. His hands were practically clubs of scar tissue. His hearing was so damaged he read lips more than listened. But he worked with absolute mechanical precision, and on his 2nd day, during a rest period, he spoke to me directly. "You know, don't you?" he said. Not a question. I nodded. "How long you been here?" 7 months. That's good. Most don't last 6 before they figure it out and try something stupid. He drank water, his ruined hands making the cup look like a toy. I've been loading for 9 years. Started when I was 17, moved through 4 different ships, transferred whenever I got close to the threshold. Threshold? The measurement they use. It's not just physical damage, it's efficiency ratio. If you can maintain minimum performance standards, they keep you working. Drop below minimum, they repurpose you. Simple logistics. How do you maintain minimum standards when your body's falling apart? Greg smiled, revealing gaps in his teeth. You learn tricks. Pacing that looks fast but conserves energy. Lift techniques that distribute strain differently. Ways to fake good health during medical scans, flexing certain muscles, controlling your breathing pattern. You game the system, cheat the measurements, stay just above the line. He paused. It doesn't last forever. Eventually, you degrade too far to fake it. But you can buy years if you're smart. Why? Why stay? Because the alternative is servitor bays, and I'd rather be conscious for as long as possible. He looked at me with something approaching pity. You're young. You probably think there's a way out. Transfer request. Medical discharge. Petition to the administratum. There isn't. You signed onto a void ship, and void ships don't let crew go until they're used up. So you adapt. You learn to survive not by fighting the system but by becoming just efficient enough that they'd rather keep you working than scrap you. He taught me his tricks over the following months. How to lift in ways that distributed force across different muscle groups, reducing strain on the parts that were most degraded. How to time rest micro moments during the loading cycle seconds when you could ease pressure on your back or flex circulation back into numb fingers. How to control breathing during medical scans so your lung damage seemed less severe. How to present your hands at angles that hid the worst scarring. I learned to game the system, and my efficiency scores stabilized. The medical officer still scanned me weekly, but his notes became routine rather than detailed. I'd found the zone Greg described damaged enough that my body was adapting in useful ways, but not so damaged that I'd dropped below the repurposing threshold. Other loaders cycled through. I watched them arrive, fresh and terrified or numb and traumatized, and I watched them disappear, one by one, taken away during maintenance periods or after medical reviews. The turnover was constant. In my 8th month, our battery went through 12 different loaders. Some collapsed from heat exhaustion. Some made mistakes around the recoil mechanisms. Some simply failed to meet efficiency standards and were removed before they became completely useless. But Greg and I survived. We became the constants, the experienced crew who trained the temporary loaders, who maintained perfect counts, who made gun assembly for one of the highest efficiency weapons in the battery. Horvath actually commended us once, his ruined voice rattling out words of praise that meant nothing because we knew what praise in the gun deck really meant. You were still useful enough to avoid the servitor bays. The pattern became my entire existence. Wake, work, count, load, sleep, repeat. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks became months. The ship moved through the void, carrying us from engagement to engagement, patrol to patrol, and we fed its weapons like components in some vast machine, ourselves becoming more mechanical with each cycle. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. I stopped thinking about home. Stopped remembering Hive Tertius, or my family, or the life I'd had before the press gangs caught me trying to avoid Imperial service. Those memories belonged to a different person, someone who still believed in concepts like dignity and future and choice. I was a loader now, defined entirely by function, measured entirely by utility, and everything else had become irrelevant. In my 10th month, Greg's luck ran out. We were running drills, not even combat, just routine practice, and I saw him falter. Just for a moment, his grip slipping on a shell casing, his movements a fraction slower than they needed to be. He recovered, completed the load, but I'd seen it. So had Horvath. And so, I suspected, had the medical officer who always seemed to appear when someone started failing. My back, Greg told me that night, during one of our brief rest periods. Something's gone wrong in the lower spine. Can't feel my left leg properly anymore. Numbness spreading. He said it calmly, like reporting weather conditions. I've got maybe 2 weeks before it's obvious in the efficiency scores. Can you fake it longer? Maybe. But what's the point? He looked at his ruined hands, flexing fingers that barely bent. 9 years I've bought. 9 years of consciousness, of being me. That's more than most loaders get. Maybe it's enough. It's not enough. It's never enough. No, he agreed. But it's what we get. The medical officer took him 6 days later. I watched it happen. Watched Greg walk away with the orderlies without resistance, his mechanical efficiency maintained until the very end. A new loader one arrived within hours. A boy from some scolum who still had smooth hands and clear eyes, and who lasted 4 days before the heat and exertion broke something vital inside him. I became the senior loader in our crew, the constant, the one who trained the temporary workers, who maintained the count, who kept Gun Assembly 4 functioning at optimum efficiency. I was 23 years old and looked 40 and felt 60, and had become exactly what Jens had joked about an ammunition component being consumed by the ship, still functional but degrading on a predictable curve toward eventual repurposing. Month 12. Month 15. Month 18. The work continued. The count continued. My body transformed in ways that fascinated the medical officer. He spent extra time on my scans now, but not because I was failing, because I was succeeding, barely, hovering right at the threshold where maximum damage met minimum efficiency. I'd become an outlier, a data point worth studying. How long could a human body sustain this workload? What was the actual limit of adaptation? I was helping them establish baselines for future crew optimization. Even in my survival, I was serving Imperial logistics. The second major engagement came in my 20th month. Another chaos incursion, larger this time, more organized. We fired for 36 hours with minimal breaks. Men died. Men were crushed. Men's hearts stopped. But the guns kept firing, and I kept loading, and the count never stopped. And when it finally ended, I had lost so much fluid that my blood had thickened and my organs were failing, and the medical team had to put me on intravenous drips just to stabilize my basic functions. But I survived. Again. Because I'd learned Greg's tricks and added my own. Because I'd optimized my movements to a degree that approached servitor-level precision while remaining human enough to avoid repurposing. Because I was, in some horrible way, good at this. Expert at being consumed slowly instead of quickly. Month 24. 2 full years on the gun deck. I was one of the longest-serving loaders in the battery's history. Horvath told me this like it was an achievement. The master of gunnery commended me during an inspection. Other loaders looked at me with something approaching awe, as if surviving this long required qualities beyond mere stubbornness. But I knew the truth. I wasn't surviving through strength or skill. I was surviving through a very specific form of failure, failing slowly enough that the system preferred to keep using me rather than replacing me. I was damaged goods that remained marginally functional, kept in service through bureaucratic inertia more than value. The medical officer's notes on my scans grew longer, more detailed. He started bringing other officers to observe my examinations, as if I were some specimen worth studying. I heard fragments of their technical discussions: degradation rate, adaptation threshold, optimization potential. They were analyzing my body's breakdown with the same clinical precision they'd use to analyze weapons. Performance. I was an experiment, a test case, a loader who'd somehow maintained functionality well beyond normal parameters, providing valuable data about human endurance limits that could be applied to future crew training and resource allocation. In my 26th month, I trained a new loader who asked me the question everyone eventually asks: how do you do it? How do you keep going? And I told him the truth. You learn to count: 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. That's all there is. The count, nothing before it. Nothing after it, just the count. Continuous and eternal. And if you can lose yourself in the counting, if you can become nothing but the number sequence, then you can survive almost anything. He didn't last a week, but I kept counting. Kept loading. Kept surviving in the margins between function and failure, between utility and repurposing. The ship moved through the void. The guns fired. The shells were loaded. The count continued. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. Month 30. Month 33. Month 36. 3 years. 3 years of continuous service that should have been impossible. The medical officer now brought delegations to examine me. Fleet logistics specialists, administratum efficiency reviewers, a representative from the Munitorum who wanted to understand how to optimize loader training based on my survival patterns. I stood there during these examinations, shirtless, displaying my grotesquely overdeveloped shoulders and back, my scarred hands, my hollowed face. While they discussed me like I was furniture, they took measurements, tissue samples, performance data. They were building a profile, a template, a standard that could be applied across the Navy to maximize loader utility. I was becoming Imperial policy. My suffering was being formalized, systematized, turned into efficiency metrics that would be applied to thousands of other loaders across thousands of other ships. I had survived so well that I was now defining what survival looked like, and that definition would be used to push others to the same extremes. The horror of that realization was profound. I hadn't escaped the system, I'd become its exemplar. My endurance would be used to justify pushing others to similar breaking points, and some part of me, the part that still remembered being a person instead of a loader, wanted to scream or rebel or somehow break the cycle. But that part was very small now. Most of me was just the count. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. Most of me had been worn down to that essential rhythm, that mechanical sequence that defined existence on the gun deck. I was becoming what Greg had described, what Jens had joked about, what the system had always intended, a component, optimized for function, sustained at minimum levels, useful until depleted. Month 40. Month 42. I passed 4 years of service, the longest-serving loader in the Time's Eternal Dominion asterisks recorded history. They gave me a commendation, a piece of parchment with official seals, and a 3-day rest period that I spent sleeping in a cramped bunk, my body so conditioned to the work that even in sleep I moved through loading motions. I knew I was approaching the end. Not because I was failing, my efficiency scores remained adequate, but because I could feel something fundamental changing inside me. My mind was becoming as mechanical as my body, thoughts were harder, emotions were distant, everything beyond the immediate task of loading shells felt irrelevant, inaccessible, like trying to remember someone else's life. I was disappearing into the function, becoming a biological servitor, still technically human, but practically indistinguishable from the mindless automata that served throughout the ship. And when that transformation completed, when there was no meaningful difference between me and a lobotomized servo skull, would the Navy even bother repurposing me? Or would they just keep me working, having achieved through slow degradation what surgical conversion would have accomplished faster? Month 48. 4 years exactly. The medical officer came for me during a routine maintenance period. I'd been expecting this for months, watching my scan results, noting the declining metrics that suggested I'd finally fallen below the threshold. But when the orderlies arrived, they didn't take me down toward the servitor bays. They took me up, toward the medical decks, toward facilities I'd never seen. They put me in a private room, actual privacy, with walls and a door. They gave me a bed that was comfortable. They treated my injuries, real treatment, not just stimulants and hydration. A Medicae specialist examined my hands, my back, my lungs, with something approaching concern rather than clinical assessment. "You're being discharged," he told me after 3 days of examination. "Medical separation from active service. Your body has sustained damage beyond what we can reasonably ask you to continue working through." I stared at him, trying to process words that didn't fit my understanding of how the system functioned. Discharged? Not. Repurposed? Repurposed? He looked confused. "You mean servitor conversion?" "Emperor, no. You're being granted veteran status, disability pension, assignment to light duties on a station facility. You've served with exceptional distinction. But the others, the loaders who disappeared, they were converted. Some were, yes, those who sustained injuries incompatible with any useful service. But you're different. You maintained function for 4 years. That's exceptional. That's worth preservation." He showed me documents, official records, medical reports, spanning my entire service. "You've become a case study. The data from your service has been invaluable for optimizing Navy crew protocols. You've contributed more to Imperial logistics than you realize. He meant it as praise. He genuinely believed he was delivering good news, that my survival had earned me mercy, that my endurance had value beyond my immediate utility. He didn't understand, or didn't care to understand, that this was worse than servitor conversion, because conversion would have been simple, clinical, a clear end to consciousness, to suffering, to the burden of remaining human, while everything human inside you had been systematically destroyed. But this was being kept alive to testify to my own destruction. This was being preserved as evidence that humans could sustain this damage and still be called survivors. This was being held up as an example to justify pushing thousands of other loaders to the same extremes. Because look, here's someone who endured it, who made it through, who proved it was survivable. They moved me to a station facility, gave me a bunk in veteran quarters, assigned me to logistics review, analyzing efficiency reports, helping optimize crew deployment across the fleet. I sit at a desk now. I read data slates. I make recommendations based on my experience about how to maximize loader utility while minimizing mortality rates, as if those two goals weren't fundamentally incompatible. And I count. Still. Always. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire. In my sleep. During work. Walking through corridors. The rhythm never stops. My hands still move through loading motions when I'm distracted. My body still tenses at sounds that approximate macro cannon discharge. I exist in a permanent state of preparing for the next shell, the next countdown, the next firing sequence. The Medicae staff say it's trauma response, conditioning that will fade over time. But I know better. I know that I'm not really here, in this comfortable facility with adequate rations and private quarters. I'm still on gun deck 17, starboard primary, macro cannon assembly 4, hauling shells through superheated air while Horvath counts down and the gun prepares to fire. I'll always be there. That's what 4 years of continuous loading does to you. It removes everything that isn't the work. And what remains isn't really human anymore. The administratum wanted my testimony for their logistics review. They wanted me to describe life on the gun deck, to provide details that could inform policy. So I'm writing this. I'm telling them everything about the heat and the count and the shells and the way bodies break down and how people disappear and where they go and what it means to survive by failing slowly enough that the system prefers consumption to discard. I'm telling them, and they'll read it, and they'll extract useful data, and they'll implement new protocols that push loaders slightly harder, because my testimony proves they can handle slightly more strain, and more men will cycle through the gun decks, and more bodies will be optimized for function, and more consciousness will be reduced to counting sequences, and the system will continue with slightly improved efficiency. That's the real horror, I think. Not that I suffered, not that others suffered, but that our suffering was useful, that it generated data, that it improved Imperial logistics, that the system doesn't just break people, it learns from the breaking, optimizes the process, and breaks the next generation more efficiently. I survived the gun deck. I'm testimony to the fact that survival is possible, and that testimony will be used to justify doing to thousands of others exactly what was done to me. Because, look, he survived, so it must be survivable, so let's maximize the strain until we find the exact breaking point where survival becomes impossible. I write this during station night cycle, when the corridors are quiet and the lights are dimmed and I should be sleeping but can't because the count won't stop. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire. Over and over. Eternal. The rhythm of my life, the thing I've become, the only identity I have left. Sometimes I see my reflection in polished metal surfaces, the hollow face, the scarred hands, the twisted posture from years of lifting shells. I don't recognize that person. He's not who I was before the gun deck. He's not even who I was during my service. He's what remains after 4 years of continuous consumption. a human-shaped thing that counts and moves and breathes, but lacks whatever essential quality made him a person. The Navy calls me a survivor, a success story, an example of exceptional service. They're not wrong, exactly. I did survive. I am exceptional. But what survived isn't really me. It's a collection of trauma responses and conditioned behaviors wrapped in damaged flesh, capable of performing administrative functions, but fundamentally incomplete in ways that probably don't register on any medical scan. I think about Mikhail sometimes, about Jens, about Greg and Kira and all the others who vanished into the servitor bays or collapsed during engagements or simply failed to meet efficiency standards. Are they better off? Is consciousness without personhood really superior to servitude without consciousness? I don't know. The question feels meaningless from inside the count. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. The administratum will receive this testimony. They'll analyze it for actionable intelligence. They'll extract efficiency metrics and training protocols and medical thresholds. And somewhere, on some void ship, new loaders will haul shells through superheated gun decks while counting down from 10, and they'll wonder where the previous loaders went, and they'll notice patterns they shouldn't discuss, and they'll learn to survive by failing slowly. And the cycle will continue, because that's what systems do. They optimize, they refine, they consume, and they call it service. I count in my sleep now. I'll count until I die, however many years or decades that takes. The countdown is permanent. The gun fired 48 months ago, but the sound is still here, still reverberating through my skeleton, still echoing in the spaces where my thoughts used to be. This is what happens inside the gun deck. This is the brutal life of a macro cannon loader. This is what survival looks like when the system is designed to consume you efficiently rather than quickly. This is what I became, and what they'll use me to make others become. And there's no escaping the count. No silence deep enough to stop the rhythm. No distance great enough to get away from the sound of shells, loading and breaches sealing, and gun captains calling down from 10, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. Always. Forever. Until there's nothing left but the number sequence and the memory of what it felt like to be something more than a loader, more than a function, more than a component in the Emperor's infinite war machine. But that memory is very far away now, almost unreachable, almost gone, almost